Hello guys, and welcome back to the computer auditing general controls discussion. Today we're going to do part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, I would urge you to go back and watch part 1 before you come on to part 2, because there will be some knowledge and some terminology that we'll be using today that you would have only been able to get from part 1. Today we want to focus in on general control. So if you have a look at our agenda, points 1 and 2 were actually dealt with in video 1 or part 1 of the series. Today we're going to deal with point 3, which is access controls, physical logic and logical access controls. We're going to focus in on access controls. We want to try and understand it. It is a critical part of our syllabus. It is going to assist us not only in answering questions for general controls and computer auditing in the first semester, but also it becomes very important for us to be able to answer and adapt to questions in the second semester when we're dealing with the cycles, which, as you would know, is a big part of the second semester. And then in our final video, we're going to deal with point 4 and 5, which is where we deal with program change controls as well as interface management and other topics. It is important to note that program change controls often seems to get examined, and so I want you to focus in and watch that video. Part 3 will be coming up shortly. I want you to watch that video so that you understand what we're dealing with and that you are able to fully grasp program change controls as well as other important topics that have been added to our syllabus as of this year. So let's get straight into it. Before we actually start, I want to just recap some of the general controls principles that we actually learned in video 1, but I think it's important that we recap it so that we totally understand what's going on and we understand the split between general controls and application controls. So you guys have heard this before, but let me just reiterate it. General controls, when we talk about general controls, we're dealing with controls that control the environment around the hardware and the software at our client's company. So we look at how does anyone, particularly an unauthorized person, how do they gain access to the hardware and the software? So those are the questions we want to try and ask. Those are the things we want to try and discover. So we're dealing mainly with the environment around the computers, around the IT department. We're dealing the access to the hardware, to the software. We're dealing with the attitude of the IT department, the attitude of management towards the IT department. So these are the things we're dealing with when we talk about general controls. You guys will remember from the previous video, we went through the 5 components of the general controls, and so those are exactly what we're talking about. Now with application controls, we're dealing more specifically with a given application. So for example, if you were to use your cell phone as an example, right? So in order to access your cell phone, we first need to find your cell phone. Now you may have your cell phone locked away in a cupboard. You may have your cell phone put away into your bag or your handbag if you're a lady. And so the first is a physical access control. That's what we would consider to be general controls. Then when you try and enter your cell phone, you might have a fingerprint sensor, or you might have a code, a PIN code that you need to enter before you access the software on your cell phone. So that is also a type of general control. It is a logical access control, so it's a bit more tricky to get over than a physical access control, but it is still a general access control. But then you will find that some cell phones actually allow you to lock specific apps. So you have a password on a specific app. So for example, if someone needs to access your WhatsApp or access your Facebook, they need to then have a password that you enter in order to access Facebook or to access WhatsApp. Now these are considered to be application controls because they're specific. The password and the control is specific to for example, Facebook. Facebook is a good example because it's whenever you're entering and exiting Facebook, or whenever you're entering Facebook, you need to actually have your PIN code before you enter. So that is an example of a specific application control. It's only specific to, for example, Facebook. So that's the difference between general and application controls. Now I want to focus in on access controls. So we said now that we have three types of access controls. We've got physical access controls. When we talk about physical access controls, I want you to start thinking hardware. Hardware means printers, laptops, desktops for some people, servers, server rooms, databases, backups, storage. Those are things that we would consider to be hardware. Now, physical access controls protects against access to hardware. So whenever we are talking about physical access control, you must think to yourself, how do I prevent the person from gaining access to my cell phone? How do I prevent the person from damaging my cell phone? Well, you put it in a protective case. You put it into your handbag or into your locker and you lock it away. So these are things that you can do to prevent people from gaining physical access to your cell phone. When we talk about logical access controls here on point 2, then we're talking about access to the software and the data that's contained in your system. So when we want to try and access your cell phone, we need to put in that PIN code. That is a logical access control. That first initial PIN code or fingerprint sensor, that is a logical access control. So when we're looking at those types of controls, your logical access controls, they are not really, the intruder or the unauthorized person has already gotten access to the physical hardware. Now we're actually trying to protect the software and the data that's contained or saved onto that physical hardware. So I want you to start thinking about, how do we protect the software? Why do we want to protect our software? Because we don't want anyone to manipulate the software. We don't want anyone to put incorrect entries in or incorrect data into our systems, because that can damage our systems and prevent us from operating in the future. So those are the two main access controls. But then there's a third access control that we don't often talk about, but is still equally important as the first two, and that is segregation of duties. Now, there's two types of segregation of duties that I want to talk about. First, the segregation of duties between the IT department and other departments. You cannot have someone in the finance department who has complete access to the IT department. Why? Because in the IT department, specific data and software and hardware is stored there that should not be accessed by anyone else but IT department staff. So you will often find in your questions and your exams that you get asked, you'll often see that the examiner will say, the IT manager has resigned, so they've appointed the financial manager to oversee finance and IT. Now that is an example of where the segregation of duties between the finance and the IT department has actually been blurred, and there's an override of that type of control. So the first is, we want the IT department to be separate from any other department in an entity. We want them to operate separately and with autonomy to any other department. But does that mean then that the IT department is should act totally independent of the rest of the company? No, because the IT department is a support function of the rest of the company. So the IT department's purpose for existing is to ensure that the entity operates, and to ensure that the entity continues to operate profitably in the future. So as a result, when we say that the IT department must remain separate and autonomous, it just means in terms of controls, we expect them to act in the best interest of the controls and not in the best interest of another department. That does not mean that they should not act as a support function and fully support and enable the rest of the entity to function. Okay? So even though they are separate and they should not be interfered with, they still need to support the entity. Then the second type of segregation of duties that I want to discuss is segregation of duties within the IT department. So first we dealt with other departments from the IT department. Now we're going to deal with within the IT department. There are different people with different skill sets. So for example, in the IT department, you would have a programmer or a developer, someone that creates the system. And then also that person will be required to make any amendments or changes to the system in the future. That is a developer. A developer will develop and create controls to fit into the system. And a developer should never be involved in administering the system. Why? Because an administrator or a technical administrator is someone who ensures that the controls are accurately implemented. Now, if we give the developer the ability to administer the system as well as develop the system, because he understands how the system was developed, he will be able to override the control. He will be able to break that control. So we want to keep the developer separate from the administration of the system. We want to keep the developer separate from the user of the system. When I say the user, I mean, for example, the developer creates a software that accountants will use to record all of the journal entries. The developer will, when they develop the system, they will ensure that each debit has a credit. For example, that is a control. Each debit must have a credit, otherwise the journal will not be passed. If we now put the developer in contact with the financial manager and the financial manager wants to override that control, he can request the developer to administer a change in the system. When he does that request, the developer will then override the control, which will then break the control. So we want to try and prevent that from happening. And how do we prevent that from happening? We ensure that the developer stays separate from all types of administration and stays separate from the user, particularly when the user is looking for administration, okay, or looking for some assistance with the system. The only time that the user and the developer should meet is when the system is either being changed or a new system is being created. So that's what we talk about when we talk about the IT department, segregation within the IT department. Developers must remain separate from administration. Let's look at physical controls in a bit more detail. Physical controls, think about how do we want to prevent people from getting access to our laptop or our cell phone. First, we want to ensure that everyone is identified. Okay, we want to ensure that everyone has an ID card. Sometimes companies are also becoming very advanced and using fingerprint or facial recognition, biometric authentication to get their people in and out of areas. Now I want to, particularly when I talk about identification, I want to focus in on the IT department. So the IT department is going to be a group of officers physically, it's a group of officers within our firm, within our building. Before anyone enters and exits that department, they need to be able to be identified, particularly if they are other personnel, so other staff members. So this point one, identification actually ties in with visitors and with other personnel. So we want to be able to identify everyone that enters and exits. Not only that, we want to ensure that there's limited access to the people that enter and exit from the IT department. So not everyone has access into the IT department, only specific people. Now that deals with, so the first 3 points here deal with identification of a human. We want to know who's entering and who's exiting. We want one entry point, one exit point, and we really want to keep measures and keep control on what happens in terms of movement in the IT department. All right, so that deals with humans. The next thing is, because humans often will use computers to bypass the physical control, we want to have some way to identify the computer. Now, each computer is given a special number when it connects to the network, right? To a network. And that number is called the IP address or the IP number. So the IP number or the IP address specifically identifies a given computer. Every time the computer logs back into the network, that number then comes up again as that IP address having been logged in. So we can specifically identify which computer has logged into the network. So when we are talking about identification, IP addresses become critically important because we can also then track the movement of a given laptop, the movement of data, what a given laptop has done on the network if it is specifically identified with the accurate IP address. So that is another way to identify the movement of people and data and computers within the network and in IT department. When we're dealing with visitors, every now and then we're going to have a visitor that either enters into our entity or enters into the IT department. Now, there's a variety of reasons why this may happen. For example, someone needs to do maintenance, they need to put in new servers, they may need to simply just paint and build things. So there are a variety of reasons why we can have people visiting the IT department or the entity as a whole. What is important is that the visitors never arrive unannounced. We need to measure and control their movements throughout the department. How do we do that? We ensure that the visitor is given a tag, arrives by approval, so a prior appointment before they arrive. When they arrive, they're given a tag. They are cleared by security so that security knows who they are. Security knows where they will be going, so that if they're found in a place that they're not supposed to be, security can notify management. And then they are only given access to the places that they need to go to. So they're not just given free rein to walk anywhere in the entity. If they need to go, for example, to the operations department, they are only given access with their card to enter into the operations department. And that's why that planning is required. That's why you need to have an appointment. The security needs to be notified before the visitor comes, so that we can sort out their tag, so that when they come, they're given the accurate tag to go into the specific place that they need to go. And once they are finished there, then they can't go anywhere else. They must exit the building. So that's why we talk about only specific, the access is given for what they needed to do. When they arrive, they shouldn't be allowed to walk around. They should be allowed to wait for a staff member or the staff member that they're there to meet, for that person to come and pick them up. So they will wait at reception. When the staff member comes, he will fetch the visitor and take the visitor to where they need to go. So constantly, whenever the visitor is in the building, they are constantly being monitored. Number one, by the use of technology, so tags, any other biometrics that we're using. So they're monitored by the system, but they're also monitored by a human being, that being the person that they're there to visit. So the person is, that's why I got this word here, escorting. Escorting means to take someone somewhere. So you constantly are accompanying someone. You're with someone all the time. You're escorting them throughout the building or wherever they need to go in the building. So far we dealt with identification of IT staff as well as, to a small extent, other staff. Now I want to look a little bit more detailed into other staff. So the first thing is, we want to know that other personnel should be either in a separate building or in a separate department as the IT department. So they should not sit in the same place. The IT department should be locked away from the rest of the entity. Okay, so it needs to be in a separate department or, if possible, in a separate building. Other staff members should only be given restricted access to the places that they need to go. If they are entering into the IT department, then we must always escort them. Someone from the IT department should always escort them, and they should be required to fill in their details and the reason for their visit. So they need to fill in a register before they visit the IT department. We also spoke about a fireproof door and a flood-proof. So the IT department needs to have a fireproof door, and the entire department needs to be flood-proof, meaning that if there's a flood, if there's water, heavy rain and water, then somehow the water does not enter into the IT department. It is diverted away from the IT department. Why? Because in the IT department we have technology and specific servers and data backups and those types of things that cannot be damaged by water or heat. So that's why we have a fireproof door, and the entire building is fireproof, as well as we have some protection against flood. So that's other personnel. Now I want to go on to point 4, which is the data center. Now when I talk about the data center, many people will know the data center by another name. That name is the server room. So when we're talking about the server room or the data center, firstly, it needs to be in a place that's flood fireproof. So I'm not going to say that again. It needs to be flood and fireproof, the data center. But there needs to only be one entry and one exit into this room. The server room should not have multiple doors, should not have windows. It should only have one door that leads from inside the entity into the server room. So it cannot have an externally facing door. It must only have an internally facing door and only one access point. The door should close automatically. The entire server room should be monitored by CCTV camera. The server must not be placed in a place where it can have access to the sun or heat. It must not be placed on the floor, because then flood or water can spill on it or drop on it. It needs to be placed above floor level in this flood and fireproof room and away from any heat source. So away from large air cons, away from the sun, away from any windows. As I've already said, the server room will not have a window. The other thing is the entry and exits of wires, because you'll see in the server room there are lots of wires. The entry and exit of wires needs to be very, very neat. So wires cannot be lying everywhere. People cannot be allowed to trip or fall or damage the server or pull wires out of the server when you're not supposed to. So everything in the server room needs to be very neat and tidy. Server room needs to be off the floor and on the wall or mounted somewhere and away from a heat source. Now finally, I want to deal with end user computers. So far we've been talking about the IT department in identification. Then we spoke about people who enter the company or enter the IT department. Then other staff members that enter into the IT department. And then finally the server room. The thing that we've missed is that the IT department will have a computer in every person's office. For example, information technology people at the university will give me a laptop that I use when I'm doing my lectures, or that I use when I'm doing my supervision or sending emails. So that laptop is in fact part of the IT department, but I take it with me wherever I go. There needs to be certain protections, certain controls put in place on the specific laptop in order to prevent people from entering the system or damaging the laptop. So the first thing that you'll find is that all of our laptops have an automatic timeout and a lock. So after a specific number of minutes, I believe it's 5 minutes, if there's no activity on your laptop will automatically shut down, close down and lock. So that if anyone else attempts to enter it, they need to enter in the password. This control here results in a logical control. We also need to have the computers away from any windows or doors that are visible to the outside. So you will know that, for example, if someone's office is placed on the second floor, the office closest to the corridor will have all of their windows closed, and they should not open their windows when students or when visitors are walking around, because that when people see the laptop, then they want to steal it. If we are not using our computers and we're not using our offices, we must lock our computers away. And you often see lecturers having this thing called a Kensington lock that they put. So it's a little wire cable that they put onto their laptops in order to lock their computers away. So now we've dealt with physical access controls. I want to just talk about some security principles before we go forward. Security principles or practices that we need to incorporate into our security policy. As an auditor, you are very interested in the client's security policy. Why? Because that allows you to understand how rigorous, how strong the internal control environment is. So if you are able to spot these principles coming out in the security protocols and security policy of your client, then you know that they believe in strong controls, and that allows you as the auditor to place more reliance on their system. So it's critically important that we assess these as auditors. Let's talk a little bit about them. So the first is least privilege. Least privilege is a principle that says people should only be given access to the system or the area in the business that they need to have access to, that it is necessary for them to have access to in order to execute their duties. So no one from the debtors department should be allowed into the operations department, for example, or no one from the cleaning department should be allowed into the exams department in the university, for example. They will only be allowed into the exams department when there are no more tests or exams there and they need to clean. So once tests and exams are over, then we'll get the cleaners in to clean the exam department. But other than that, they are not allowed into that department. That is an example of least privilege. So least privilege is when you only give employees the privilege or the access to the areas or the aspects of the computer system that they need to execute their duties. The next is a fail-safe. A fail-safe simply means that the system is designed to protect itself if a control fails. Let's talk about an example. When we are given laptops at the university, we are told that if we are not using our laptop, we need to lock our laptops. Okay, we need to lock them away, and we need to then when we want to use them again, we have to put in our password and open it. Now, if you remember what we just spoke about under physical access controls, when that fails, when the lecturer fails to lock their laptop, the laptop automatically locks after a specific time. That is a fail-safe. And that brings us to point 3, which is control at depth. That is talking about having also 2 or more controls. So we need to have multiple controls protecting the same thing, the same data or the same physical access. There are multiple controls. And if you think of that in the university setting, when you attempt to enter into the accounting or auditing department, you must have your student card. So that's one control. Then if you attempt to enter into my office, I either need to be here and you come in, or if I'm not here, the door is locked and you're unable to enter. So that is an example of where there are 2 controls, the front door as well as the door to my office. Now, even if you do gain access to my office, then my laptop is locked away with its Kensington lock. So now there are 3 controls that are protecting the laptop from being stolen. There's the front door, the door to the office, and the Kensington lock or the chain that the laptop is locked to. So there's multiple controls to protect the laptop from being stolen. The 4th point is logging. Now, logging is basically a record. A record of all activities are kept, no matter what, whether it's a record of physical movement of a employee, whether it's physical movement of the actual computer. This is logging. Logging is when we keep a specific activity log of everything that happens. Now I want to talk about some logical access controls. In logical access controls, we're trying to protect software, as mentioned previously. And so these are some of the things we can do during logical access controls. Now think about, again, your cell phone. When you have your cell phone attempts to identify who you are. It does that via fingerprint scanner. Or you may have a PIN code, and whoever has the PIN code is obviously the owner of the phone. So it uses a PIN code or an ID and a fingerprint scanner to identify who is accessing the phone. So then we come down to authentication, which is where we have the passwords or PINs. And in authentication, the system would ask the user for a specific password or a specific PIN. You'll find that banking apps often use this thing called a one-time password, which means for each banking transaction that you do, you get a separate password SMS to you, and then you need to use that in order to process the transaction. We also have pre-recorded or preset security questions. You would often find they would ask you, what is your mother's maiden name, those types of things, and that assists you in identifying or authenticating who is accessing the account. Then this system of a dongle is not often used anymore, or is being used less and less. So a dongle used to be a device with a specific program, a specific sum built into it, right? So an algorithm built into it. And what that would do is it would generate random numbers based on the algorithm. The bank will also have the same algorithm loaded onto its system, and you, using the dongle, would generate a number that would agree with the bank's number because they're using the same algorithm or the same sum. And it's based on, for example, days. So they might take the day and add 2 to it, and then you get a number. And so if today is the 25th, they'll add 2, you get 27. You type in 27. The bank uses a similar algorithm, and then it also gets 27. When the two numbers agree, then the transaction will be processed. Now, banks have moved away from this because it was found that the dongle was easily passed from one person to the next, and very quickly the bad guys eventually realized that the algorithm is programmed. They were able to download the algorithm, and then they were able to replicate it. It is still used in smaller companies because in order to move up to the one-time only password, banks require you to sometimes pay more and register your employees on the system, which companies don't want to do. So unfortunately, some companies are still using dongles and passwords. The next one that we're going to move on to is authorization. Now, authorization is when someone external to the preparation of a payment or external to the process that is being done is required to come in and authorize the transaction. For example, if you were to load a payment onto internet banking, you would be the preparer. Once you have completed your preparation of the transaction, it will then be sent to your boss, and your boss will review the payment and then authorize it before the payment leaves your bank account, your company's bank account. So that is an example of authorization, where you get more than one person in an entity to look at a given transaction. Now, with read and write functionality, only the preparer should have read and write functionality, but the reviewer or the person that's authorizing it should only have read functionality. Now, why is that? Because we do not want the person who is authorizing it to make changes to the payment. If a change is required, the authorizer should send it back to the person that prepared it. They make the change, and then only can the change be processed. So we need to understand that that is critical, because if not, the person who is authorizing it, or the boss or your manager, will be able to amend payments, pay themselves, change bank accounts, will be able to commit fraud. They have too much power. There's not enough segregation of duties in that case. So we must have the read and the read-write functionality set very specifically. So only the people that are preparing it have write functionality. People that are reviewing it only have read functionality. So these are things that we want to think about with logical access controls. The next part is logging. Now, we already spoke a little bit about logging. Logging means keeping a record of people that have accessed a specific area or a specific software during a given time. We want logging to happen basically on everything that someone does on their laptop should be logged. Every single thing that they enter into, every single transaction they make, every single thing they basically type, they track everything that happens on your laptop. And that is the type of logging that we have at most firms, in order to identify who has made what change and what changes were made. Access table is simply a table containing the staff member's name and what modules or what software they have access to. For example, you do not want the person who is in charge of payroll to have access to the production software, because then they would interfere and damage or change production deadlines, production targets or quantities, and that can negatively affect the operations or the production of the company. So we want to ensure that the access tables are always kept up to date, so we know who has access to what. It's simply a list of who has access to what, and we review it regularly to ensure that it's still applicable. The next logical access control that we will have is password controls. Now, you guys have seen this before. There are a long list of password controls that I want to take you through. But first, before we get into the list, I want you to understand the purpose of us having passwords. So the purpose of us having passwords is to ensure that there's no unauthorized or illegal access to, firstly, our hardware, our software, and our data. So we want to ensure that only the people that access our data, our software and our hardware are people that are authorized to do so, people that are supposed to do so. So in order to enhance that, and in order to ensure that that objective is met, we then develop rules or controls around passwords. Now, whenever we talk about passwords, I want you to always refer back to the purpose of the password. How is it making sure that the user is the authorized user? So let's come to point one. We say that we want to have a unique username or a unique ID and a unique password. Why do we want a unique username and a unique password? Each person in the entity should have a unique username and a unique password so that we can identify who has done what on the system, right? And in that way, we are able to authorize certain people to have access to the system and certain people should not have access to the system. So it helps us to ensure that we meet our objective. People that leave the employment of the entity should be removed timeously, meaning immediately, as soon as their contract, as soon as their employment has been terminated, they should be removed off the system. The username should be shut down so that they can no longer access the system after having left the entity. If we have new employees should be required to develop their own passwords and not use the passwords that are allocated. You will often find when you go to an entity that when you get a new laptop, the technician or the administrator, IT administrator, would load a generic password on to your laptop. If you do not change that password, then it is not unique, because that technician will be using the same password for every new employee that comes in. So new employees should be required and forced to develop their own passwords as soon as they enter into the entity. Password database is a list of all the passwords, similar to an access table. It's just a list of all the passwords that are assigned to specific usernames. Now, what would happen is when someone enters into the system and they enter their password in, the software will then go back to the password database to ensure that the password entered matches the password that is on the database. What is critically important is that we keep that database very secure, because it has everyone's password in and it's all the correct passwords. So in order to secure that database, you'd like to encrypt it and have it on a secure server, possibly outside of the entity, so not in the entity's building. This will ensure that the password database is sufficiently secure. We should encourage employees to keep their password secret so that no one else knows their password. And then we deal with length and formation of passwords. Now, you guys are familiar with this. So in South Africa, we say, listen, we need 8 characters. Sometimes we need even longer characters. Many entities would require up to 16 characters. Longer passwords are generally more secure than shorter passwords, but unfortunately in South Africa we use the minimum of 8 instead of using the more rigorous 16 character requirement. Many passwords you'll find require capital letters and small letters, so uppercase, lowercase, and the password needs to be case sensitive. So if the uppercase or the capital letter is in the wrong place, it does not get accepted. We also may require the employees to have numbers included in the password or special characters included in the password. Then, when developing password security, we must have a blacklist of passwords that are not accepted. For example, abbreviations of people's name or companies' names. Also, abbreviations or common words that are often used in the company should not be allowed. Dates should not be allowed, such as birthdays, should not be allowed to be used as passwords. So we want to have a password blacklist that stops people from using specific passwords. For example, using the same password multiple times. As you know, we require our passwords to be changed on a regular basis. Now, if we have a person that changes their password but changes it to the same password all the time, they're able to get around that requirement of having their password changed. But if we have a password blacklist, which prevents them from using specific passwords like their last used password, then we are able to increase their security. Every time they change their password, they have to think of new passwords. Now, it's very important to know that in South Africa, the duration is generally 180 days, so 6 months. Some companies will use 90 days. Overseas, they have recommended up to 30 days. So 30 days is a very short time. Every month, we require the employees to change their passwords. And they have a long list of blacklisted passwords that the employee cannot use. So that type of security is a lot stronger than what we use here in South Africa. And so maybe we should start to move to more stronger password controls. There is a downside though, because if we require people to change their passwords too regularly, we can have lots of people forgetting their passwords and hitting that button, forgot your password, because they forget their password so often. And the other thing is, if we require people to change their passwords very regularly, they may start to save their passwords. And you'll see this on, for example, Facebook. You can save your password so that every time you log on to the site, it doesn't ask you for your password, it just logs you onto your page. So if we force people to change their password regularly, we can often find that they get around that control by saving their password. So we want to discourage that behavior. Other controls that we can use, for example, root access or super user access. This should be limited to only people that require the function. So maybe only senior managers in the entity. And I stress the word senior managers or directors in the entity should have super user access. And we should be able to track and log the usage of super user accesses. Now, that means not even the super users can get around the logging requirement. So the logging should never be able to be overrid, even by super users. Then we can use database accesses in which whenever changes are made, we can trace all changes made. And we never want to have situations where utilities can be changed without, items can be changed without being able to trace who made it. Then we have supplementary controls like ensuring that there's a lock, automatic lock after 3 incorrect password attempts. Now you guys are familiar with that. That happens on Facebook often. We can time them out. So if you don't, if there isn't any activity, it automatically times you out. The line that we use in order to connect to the server needs to be encrypted. As we mentioned before, auto logging. And then we can also have additional passwords. So we can have multiple passwords to perform a given activity. So data communication, in fact, is almost a subject on its own. When we are transferring data from one place to another, we need to ensure that the data, firstly, is being transferred is accurate, that the one system can speak to the other system. And when we talk about interface controls, we'll mention that how systems need to be able to match at the point of transfer of entry. We need to have some sort of test that happens there between one system and the other. Let me explain what I'm trying to say. When you are dealing with an entity, you will find that the entity will have a separate general ledger system and a separate debtor system. Why? Because the debtor system needs specific functionality that the general ledger will not need. So when items are captured onto the general ledger and then are being transferred onto the debtor's ledger, we need to make sure that that transfer between two systems happens correctly. Right? So we need to make sure that the interface happens correctly. That's the first thing. The next thing is the data needs to be encrypted. Right? And the cabling that we use also needs to be encrypted so that no one can cut the cable and hack in. We need to make sure that that happens during communication. Firewalls are virtual walls that are created between a given laptop or a given network and the rest of the internet. This is to block access from hackers when they're attempting to gain access to our network. So those are what firewalls are. System maintenance. So system maintenance talks to the fact that we need the system to be regularly monitored. We need someone to constantly be viewing the system to identify changes that need to be made. You see? And so system maintenance often falls on the shoulders of the CIO, or we can call that person the IT director, or the IT steering committee. Right? We don't want for example, someone lower down like managers and such to get involved in system maintenance, because this is a critical thing that is very important. So we wanted to go at a very high level, at a very senior level in the company. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about system maintenance? From time to time, systems change, or we can have the system staying the same, but everything around the system, the world around the system changes. That may require us to re-look at our system and amend it in certain ways. In order to do that, there must be a formal request process. So the user of the system fills out a form, normally pre-numbered, pre-printed, sequential forms. They print out the form, they fill out the reason why they want the change to happen to a given system, and that form then is tracked through the system change to ensure that it is firstly acted on and it is acted on correctly. And so we see that when forms are filled out, it has to be a formal process, there has to be an audit trail, it has to go directly to the CIO or the IT director or the steering committee, depending what the company has in place. And then we design the system based on what the request has asked, and then we execute and we change the system during this time. Now, when we talk about system maintenance, we're going to get a little bit more in depth in the next video, in video number 3. We're going to get a little bit more in depth on what exactly is a system change. But for now, this is what you need to know, that once we finished with the request process, which sits under system maintenance, then we go into program change controls, which is in the next video. Continuity of operations. When I talk about continuity of operations, what I'm talking about is that if there is a disaster, if something goes wrong, the company does not need to shut down. The company can still operate. That is what continuity of operations is all about. The first thing that's important is that we identify risks around us. So we need to be able to look around us and identify where are the risks, what can stop us from operating, right? Then we implement things, and now these are some of the controls that we can implement. Firstly, physical location. We need to have physical location. We need to have our servers and our IT department located in an area that is not close to, for example, rivers, forests where they can catch on fire, those types of things. No windows, no outside walls, and it needs to be fire and flood proof. This can prevent damage from happening to our hardware and our software, and it can prevent us from losing data. In South Africa, we often have load shedding, and so power surge technology and power surge protection becomes critically important in South Africa. Now, generators can assist because it returns power to normal, but in order to protect our software from getting damaged or our hardware from getting damaged, we need to have what we call a surge protector. So many of you all will see, if you go to the university library or if you go to the LAN, you'll see a little red plug. We have white plugs and then we have red plugs. Those red plugs are surge protected, meaning that if there's a surge or if Eskom decides to cut the electricity, the surge of electricity doesn't come through that line. It's prevented from coming through that line. The other thing that's important with computers is that we must maintain the physical environment around it so that it's not too hot, because computers often generate their own heat. They operate best in cold conditions. So we need to have strong air conditioners to pump out cold air and to limit humidity. So computers do not enjoy humid or hot environments. They would rather be operating in a dry, cold environment. And so in our workspace, we need to make sure that we have strong air conditioners. All of this forms part of our disaster recovery plan. So if we go back a few slides where we were talking about continuity of operations, the most important thing that we need to maintain during continuity of operations is, if a disaster strikes, what do we do? And this is where our disaster recovery plan comes in. Disaster recovery plan is a document that is prepared by management. In the document, it details what needs to happen if a disaster were to strike. Who needs to do what? So it needs to be adequately designed to cover all types of disasters. All our staff need to be able to access it so that they understand what their roles are, right? Now, not all staff will be assigned a role during a disaster. For example, the cleaning staff would not be required to do a backup, but the staff that are required to do something need to be able to access the report quickly during a disaster. So if there's a lack of electricity, how can they access a hard copy, for example? That is something that management needs to think about. They need to store a hard copy somewhere. They need to have it offline instead of online. If there's no internet, they need to be able to access it offline. Each person that is required to do something should be assigned specific priorities. So what needs to be done first and what can be done second, and then also specific steps that need to be taken out. So very detailed in terms of what needs to happen. Then the disaster recovery plan needs to be tested multiple times to ensure that firstly it's still operating correctly and everyone knows what to do, and that the recovery plan was actually designed correctly. Management will review the plan because it's ultimately management's. When I say management, I mean the board of directors. King 4 ultimately puts the requirement for such a plan on the board of directors. So they will be required to review the plan. And like I said before, we need specific procedures to be there, and we need to explain who needs to do what. So some things that we want to see in the disaster recovery plan. If a disaster strikes, how do we reconstruct the data system? Okay, how do we reconstruct the data and the system from backups? That needs to be detailed. When I talk about 3 generations, I'm talking about 3 generations of backups. So we back up on day 1, and then on day 2 we also back up. That means that we've now got 2 generations. On day 3 we back up a third time. So we've got 3 generations. At all times, 3 generations of backups need to be on hand. Why do we need 3 generations of backups? Because if there is an error that happened on day 2, that error will be carried forward to day 3 and 4 and so on. But if we have 3 generations, we're able to spot where the error has taken place, and we're able to go back to a backup before the error had taken place. So that's why we need 3 generations at all times, or 3 different backups at different times. We need to conduct backups regularly, and for your purposes, you should know that backups should be done every day. When I say backups need to be stored off-site, there will be a backup that will be stored on-site, but a different copy needs to go off-site, meaning away from the company. If the company is hit by flood or by lightning or something like that, the building is burnt down, we still have a backup saved somewhere else, far away from our building. We need to have the backups clearly organized so we know what backup is for when. And then a mirror site. A mirror site is this: when we create the system, we create a copy of the system. And when we create that copy of the system, the mirror site then operates differently or separately from the actual main site. The main site is where everyone is working, everyone is putting in data, everyone does their work, but the mirror site is actually left alone. It's not touched. So that if something happens to the main system and it breaks down, we are able to quickly import the mirror site, the second system that has not been affected by the disaster, and then we're able to regain operations after performing a restoration of the backup. So a mirror site is just a separate system that is exactly the same as our system, but kept separately, but kept away from our system, so that if anything affects our system, it doesn't affect the mirror site. That's all it means. We want to ensure that, so these are other measures that we need to do to prevent disasters. We always need to service our equipment and service our software. We need to ensure that there's no key person. There's no key person in staff. We mustn't place all our reliance on one person doing something, because that makes that person very powerful, but also if something were to happen to that person, it damages the company. Insurance cover, we need to ensure that our software and our hardware particularly is under some sort of insurance cover. So if it were to be damaged or lost, we are able to be reimbursed for that. Firewalls we chatted about, and antiviruses are very similar to firewalls. And then we need to have some sort of agreements with suppliers so that if something were to happen, if we were to have some sort of disaster, they will be able to assist us. Now, social media, this is a new section, and I think it's quite a valid, important section. When is the auditor concerned about social media? And the answer is all the time. Why? Because the social media of our clients determine their reputation and therefore their going concern. So social media becomes very important when we're talking about going concern. Why? Because people often will use social media to complain or report something bad about our entity. We as the auditor need to make sure that the entity staff is actually monitoring social media and dealing with those complaints. So we are watching to make sure that the staff is monitoring and dealing with the complaints, because if they are not, it can result in reputational damage. And if there's reputational damage, then our company could suffer some going concern problems. So we as the auditor are just monitoring the policy of the entity to make sure that it takes into account social media. We're monitoring the rules of the entity to make sure that the staff is adequately managed when they are going onto social media, because often bad reputation can be created by the employees themselves. So we need to look at the staff training. And then when people are accessing the social media of our entity, it needs to be treated like a system on its own. So when you have a marketer accessing, for example, Facebook or the Facebook page that belongs to a business, it needs to be treated as a system itself. So strong password controls, logging of who enters and exits the system, logging of what activities have been done in the system. Those are the types of things that we need to look for as an auditor with regard to social media. So social media, very important from a going concern perspective. Okay guys, so we're going to leave it there for today. We're going to stop at social media. And then when we come back in video 3, which should be linked somewhere at the bottom of your screen, we are going to deal with program change controls and other controls. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.